United States in a pre-trade war dispute with China. This, some say, opens the door for more retaliatory tariffs. The ruling states that some U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods do not comply with WTO rules. The case was opened in 2012 when the United States implemented tariffs aimed at products the U.S. claimed were unfairly subsidized by Chinese state-owned companies. Joining us now to talk about the impact of this is Lebohang Pheko, Senior Research Fellow, Trade Collective Think Tank, who's furthest to my right. Azwiphelile Langalanga is International and Investment Policy Advisor at Tutwa Consultancy. He's to my immediate right. Good evening to both, and thank you so much for joining us. Perhaps let me start with you, Ms. Pheko. What is your assessment of the WTO ruling? The U.S. obviously saying that it's unfair, and it says it actually goes against the WTO rules. What are your thoughts?
So there has been a lot of dispute around the dispute mechanisms of the WTO for many years. It doesn't start here. And the spat between the U.S. and China, this has very much been the playground of it. And some of the critiques of the dispute resolution mechanisms in any case have been that they're slightly undemocratic, they're incredibly opaque, they're quite expensive, and they also give rise to the opportunity for retaliatory action, particularly from stronger economies. So what happens when you have two very strong economies in the room is that it's really a game of attrition. And I think the U.S. in particular have had a tendency over the last 20 years or 25 years of the WTO's existence of throwing their toys somewhat out of their court, particularly because of their own approach towards subsidizing their own producers, domestic subsidies, and their very onerous tariff regimes upon other countries. So it's incredibly difficult to penetrate their own markets.
Is the WTO overreaching, though? What are your thoughts?
So, I think in this instance, the one thing is that the jurisprudence within the WTO is not very easy to follow for various reasons. The one is that they don't make their rulings very accessible to the public scrutiny. The second is that there's an unevenness in access to those processes. And thirdly, although their rulings are binding to some extent, because of the dispute mechanisms and the appeal processes, they can take a very long time to actually be settled, literally years and years and years. So really, it often feels as though the case law is being created, and there's no history to really draw on, which is unfortunate. Another thing is that the pool of countries who can potentially be part of the jurors, so to speak, is actually dwindling, because many countries are feeling that the WTO is a bit of a time-wasting exercise in terms of the costs, the resources, and the ability to get deals which are favorable to their own national interests.
So we'll talk about the people who sit on the body, Mr. Langalanga, but I'd like to hear from you just about the U.S. understanding of the fine, saying that it undermines the WTO rules, arguing that it forces the United States to use distorted Chinese prices to measure the subsidies. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the U.S. has a point. So the ruling itself of the WTO is a bit, in my view, it's a bit confusing in that they do say there is a trade distortion from the Chinese side, in that the Chinese, they supports its companies, and then because of that, then the prices they become lower, and that is the products become uncompetitive or too competitive in the market. And there was a thinking when China joined the WTO in 2001, because China is not really an open market economy. It's what they call a state capitalism. So there was a thinking that the WTO itself will kind of discipline China, so that China will kind of change its rules, become more open, and play in a sort of a level playing field. And when it comes to the WTO, the appellate body, or the DSM, which is the panel or the court itself, the way the WTO rules are written, they're written in such a way that these guys, the jurors, they're not supposed to be creative, the way, for instance, Constitutional Court will be in South Africa. They are supposed to be very narrow in terms of their interpretation of the rules, because these are very political rules. So, but the U.S. has been saying that the WTO courts have been kind of being too creative in creating the law, whereas in that space, the feeling is that the law should really be created by the political principles.
So is China itself also being truant in saying that this decision helps create a level playing field?
Yes. So China, for now, because it seems it suits them. they kind of agree with the decision. But the real issue is that China subsidizes its companies. And subsidizing companies is illegal under the WTO. But then also what compounds the situation is that China is not an open market economy. So it's difficult to compare. So in a proper, if it's South Africa and the US, which have open markets, if South Africa is saying China, the US is dumping, you compare the two prices because there's an open market. You can easily compare. But in China, it's very opaque. The government gives companies money, and they can then play around with the prices.
So,
and this is what the US is saying.
So just looking back at the history then of the WTO, so there are those who'd say, it would say tariffs in a way have helped build economies, but then at the same time, developing economies can't survive, at least in incubation, if it has to compete with subsidized products. So is that where the stickler really is, that the rules are not clear and it's somewhat contradictory, ambiguous?
I actually think the rules are very clear. I just think that they're incredibly unfavorable for the most part for developing economies, other than the ones which are more robust and larger, such as Brazil, China and India, which have emerged over the past few years as very strong, vigorous economies. But for the most part, the architecture of the WTO is built on free market access. And this also includes then the state retreating from its role in protecting domestic producers, cutting on subsidies. And I think this double standards which have been exercised by the US and the European Union are quite well documented, in particular in their agricultural sector, whereby, for example, European farmers are subsidized huge amounts, which is exactly where the dumping comes in, because then they overproduce, and then they need a free market, which would usually be countries in the global south, such as African markets. So I think the rules are clear, but they just don't work very favorably for African and many developing economies. And I think linked to that is also the fact that there is no country, I can't think of a single economy, my colleague may have an example, that has actually grown without protection and without being initially insulated from the vagaries of market forces, import surges, unfair competition, and so on and so forth.
So what you're saying, for instance, if developing countries in Africa, developing economies in Africa are trying to diversify, for instance, they will automatically have to protect their markets in order to help them grow.
They must. And I think that what the World Trade Organization does, it makes a few assumptions which are just not true. It assumes that all countries are equal, and they're not. It also assumes that this is all about trade, and it actually isn't. And I think one of the contentions of the WTO is that it has imported issues like services, which include access to health, access to education, access to our banking services, which really should not be the remit of trade issues and the economy. It has also meant that, issues like intellectual property in relation to licensing, and I think we're aware of the issues around access to HIV and antiretroviral drugs, and that the huge cost that they had initially. It also means that, basic human dignity and human rights around access to health care are then compromised because of this notion that the market is king. And states have to be involved in this. And I think this is where China becomes a sticky point to the US, because they are very statist. The state is very central, and I think rightly so, as many countries should be, to then managing the economy. It is statist because what is the market? The market is this vague, nameless, faceless place. And I think we saw in 2008 that it is extremely dangerous to leave our fate to this nameless, faceless place called the market.
And just looking at, in this case, the national security grounds that the US has often used, and also to push off people off the advisory panel, how much has that hurt developing countries, and why has the WTO not reined in or taken a firm position on it, especially as Ms. Pheko says, we've seen more and more people leave the body because of that?
Yes, maybe. I think also before we talk much about developing countries. So China, there's other issues that China is treated as a developing country. And China is really no longer a developing country. So it's a developed country. And this is one of the reasons why the US is saying that there should be more, the rules should sort of, because China didn't reform after 2001. So either it then gets classified as a developed country, then it can then have rules that apply to developed countries applying to it. And when it comes to developing countries, the WTO is a good place for developing countries in that you then don't have serious power relations. It levels the playing field. But as my colleague is saying, there's not really been, so in trade negotiations, there are losers and winners. And developing countries, they were kind of losers when the WTO was formed or when it came from the GATT into the WTO. And there's not been really, so if they are losers in trade, what you normally do is you cushion the fall so that they don't really have a hard impact. They don't lose, they don't have a serious developing impact on them. So, but this has not really happened.
Am I getting the sense, Ms. Pheko, that you're not quite in agreement?
No, I'm hearing my colleague. I think that indeed the architecture is quite correct, but I'm not sure whether it's, I don't think that the WTO has succeeded in leveling the playing field at all, which is why you have constituencies such as the Cotton Group. You had the group of 80 countries, which were, including South Africa. You had the NAMA 11, non-agricultural market access. These constellation of groups which want to aggregate their interests as a bloc at the WTO, specifically because they feel rather aggrieved and marginalized by those processes. And unfortunately, politics do, as my colleague has said, they do play a role in the WTO. So, for example, if you look at the dispute resolution mechanism, many developing countries, the ratio of countries that go there, for example, there's a direct correlation between the strength of the economy and their capacity to actually pursue those processes. The cost is absolutely prohibitive. The legal mechanisms and the legal savvy that's necessary is also quite prohibitive.
Okay. Let me ask you both then. I'll start with you, Mr. Langalanga. Is this an opportunity to reform the multilateral trading system?
By big economies, yes. Remember, this fight has nothing to do with the developing countries. It's about the Quad, the EU, Japan, the US, and now China. It's about how these countries, the original guys who formed the Bretton Woods institutions, it's about how they deal with China. And it's not, maybe it's an opportunity to reform, but it will be misleading, or it will be early advice for developing countries to look at China as a developing country and think that it carries their interests in this
briefly, what do you think? Is it an opportunity?
I'm not sure, because I do think that a lot of these institutions, including the WTO, they reproduce very troubling geopolitical power relations between the North and the South. And certainly the US, the Quads, the US, Canada, Japan, the EU, they have not so far shown themselves interested per se in wanting to cede their power, which unfortunately is a reproduction of their power and international hegemony in other sectors.
All right, thank you very much to you both. Lebohang Pheko, Senior Research Fellow, Trade Collective think tank, as well as Azwiphelile Langalanga, International and Investment Policy Advisor at Tutwa Consultancy. Right, let's take a quick break.